Hello, welcome to today's edition of the Academy. Today we're going to take a little different tack than we normally have been doing. Instead of reviewing a military document and about tactics and applying it at the tabletop, I thought take advantage of a viewer's comment recently and questions about some issues that he's encountering in one of his games to try to kind of almost review some of the concepts we have within the Academy and see how it will apply to the tabletop, and especially to his circumstances, and I'm sure some of your circumstances as well. So, before we get started, if you find these videos interesting, very helpful, please don't be afraid to share. Please do like them, and if you can subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and you'll find out when the next time I upload a video. So, let's get to the topic. Now, this particular commenter was dealing with a kind of urban combat within the BattleTech world and setting. Now, Alpha Strike is a game I've actually played a couple times, and when in it, you're basically mechs fighting within usually a city, though we've played in different settings as well. Now, in this game, initiatives basically run by roll the dice, alternates. It doesn't alternate, but it's determined at the beginning of each turn. And both players get to move their units during the quote movement phase, beginning with the person who lost initiative first. Contrary to some initial impressions, if you have initiative, maybe going first isn't necessarily the best. Maybe going second is better. I've discussed that concept in some other videos as well. But the idea is both sides alternate their movement of their mechs during the movement phase, starting with the person who lost initiative. Then when they go to the combat phase, the person who lost initiative fires all of his weapons, all of his mechs, and then the person who won initiative then fires all of his. So now, this brings up a slightly different mechanic than some other games, such as the typical you move, I move, or your turn, my turn thing, or the random activation where we alternate activating one unit at a time, doing both movement and shooting, or such as bolt action where it's random based on a dice draw who gets to do the next action. So this is kind of interesting, and it does lend itself to some interesting applications on the tabletop. So what I like to do is to actually take a look at the photo that this commenter has sent me, and let's discuss some of the principles. Now, as a preface to this, he has deployed his units in this particular scenario, what's typically referred to as a turtling by a lot of gamers. It's where you pile up your units in one corner of the board or one small section of the board, and just wait for your opponent to come and shoot at you. Now, some players think this is unsportsmanlike, but if you've seen any of my earlier videos, you know that this is not really the case. It actually is not favored because of really two reasons. It has a tendency to make the game a little more boring because there's not as much dynamics. There's not a lot of movement going around, except on the attacker's side. However, I think subconsciously one of the biggest reasons people complain is the fact that it presents a serious dilemma to the attacker, the one who's not turtling, and they just don't particularly care for dealing with that particular type of dilemma. Okay, so having said that, there are some scenarios in many game systems where turtling is actually almost essential to achieving some of the mission objectives. One example that's common in some game systems is the idea of hold until relieved, as a kind of a setting where the defender has to maintain presence in a certain part of the battlefield, whether it's the center or a corner or whatever. They have to have a certain number of surviving units or keep the enemy out of the area at the end of the game. Now, in order to do that effectively, you don't want to be moving your units around, giving your opponent openings into that space, or potentially getting your forces divided up and shoot up piecemeal. Keeping them together allows for a lot of supporting fire and overlapping threats. Okay, so that's a good option to use this turtling idea. The other one is where you've got to hold some objectives within the game. Either you get points for each turn you hold them, or you have to have them held at the end of the turn, and the opponent's goal is to take those from you. This is really where turtling seems to pay off, because if you can flood your objectives with a lot of units, it makes it much more difficult for the opponent to get the numbers he needs on that objective to secure it from you. The best maybe you can do is contest it. But again, if you have a large number of units, you can kind of keep him away for much of the game, making it very hard for him to get in near you. So there are some reasons to do turtling. Now, having said that, there is a disadvantage to turtling, but not in just the fact that you are turtling. It is what it can actually lead the player to do. Turtling is very easy to do. It requires very little thought, to be honest with you. However, to do it well requires substantial thought. So sometimes they fall into a path or pattern where we just turtle up and just kind of hold everything together and just fire what we can, instead of deciding to apply some of the basic rules that we've covered in videos past to the entire army as they shoot, or even breaking up a part of the army and making it mobile while the rest of the army becomes that turtle that holds your objective. Having almost like a harassment force, if you think in some of the earlier ancient times when they're fighting, you got the infantry holding the position, holding the line, holding the field of battle, and the cavalry and skirmishers engaging separate from that battle line. So that's the mobile portion and the static portion. You need to be able to do that when you're turtling to give you flexibility. Always a good thing to remember. And the other aspect is that if you fall into this default of turtling, you have so much going on in such a small space that you might distract yourself from, it just becomes a little bit harder to manage all the things going on, and potentially even in the case where units can interfere with each other as far as fields of fire. In some game systems, you can't fire through one of your own units without giving your opponent an advantage or even preventing you from shooting. And so that can make things a little tougher. So turtling isn't some magic fix. But with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at this particular individual's picture and some of the dilemmas, and let's walk through some of the thoughts I've got. And please take the time to comment below with your thoughts and opinions on this. This is all about dialogue. We're all trying to learn, okay? So let's take a look at this. Okay, so here's the Battletech board that was set up, and you'll see a classic turtling over in the right-hand corner here, where my commenter has placed his 3 mechs, one by each of the 3 buildings, giving some little bit of supporting fire for each of them. The opponent has deployed in the opposite corner of the board, a little bit more spread out, not as much for turtling. And what is interesting is there's a lot of space between them. So this is often going to be the case when players do decide to take an approach with turtling. The attacker generally will have to traverse some further terrain to get into good position to actually bring shots on and threaten the defender. But let's take a closer look at this particular setup. Now, the first thing you'll notice is the position of the 3 defenders' mechs in what I'll call a tighter formation. And there is only one enemy mech that's kind of isolated a little bit closer to them. This actually is one of the initial advantages of opening with a turtle deployment like this. Because as I've mentioned in my Making a Fair Fight Unfair video, you can link to it up here in the corner, you want to concentrate your combat capability against a smaller portion of the opponent. Now here, if he's able to get his mechs individually into range of your 3, then you can do a lot more damage to that one mech instead of having to deal with the onslaught of all 3. That takes some extra work on the attacker's part to try to coordinate or choreograph the movement of his mechs so that they can all emerge from cover
to support each other against your combined force. So this is one of the reasons some people don't like turtling, because it makes them have to do this extra thinking. Okay, you'll notice that from the positions the defender has chosen, he does have, some good fire lanes, it appears. But let's look at each of them individually. Let's look at the first mech. And you can see here, his position actually provides him less less area coverage or field of fire than initially it looked. He does have most of the main thoroughfare in both directions. However, seeing those buildings blocking line of sight can interfere with his coverage. Now, of course, he is shooting through some terrain, and that's okay. That's going to be the case in most games. But now, if you take a look at number 2, mech number 2 here, his field of fire is actually even more restricted because he's set further back and more buildings are getting in his way. So he has a much smaller overlapping field of fire than it initially looks. And when you finally take a look at the last mech, his is by far the most restricted. However, he does have a very good visibility down the main thoroughfare, similar to the first mech. But as you can see with these 3 overlays, there's a very small area where they all can see effectively the same location. So if you'll notice, this actually gives the opponent a lot more cover than it initially appears. So just looking at the attacker's mech's positions, he's got actually a very short distance he needs to travel across the the defender's arc of fire, and he'll still be in cover then. So I don't know the exact distances these mechs can move in one turn, but in some of the faster mechs, it may actually be possible to dash across that field of fire and get into a position where you can't be shot at. Now that's important because it will allow the attacker to leverage all of that empty space that's not covered using the buildings to block line of sight in order to get in a position where he can launch a concerted attack against that held position. So even though the initial turtling position looks good, it's allowing the opponent enough opportunity to maneuver out of threat. So there may be some things we could do better here. Okay, before we look at the option that we can take, let's make one more comment here. You'll notice that there is a very narrow arc of fire, field of fire for these mechs. So they're going to be shooting mostly at long range, and that could be to his detriment. He also is kind of locked in position. He doesn't have a lot of freedom of movement to allow him to maneuver his mechs to get converging fire on a single approaching mech. It's going to be hard for him to keep his mechs outside the arc of multiple of his opponent's mechs. So this is not necessarily the best way to go about doing turtling. It limits his mobility and makes it really easy for the attacker to come in from multiple directions even and converge on a target mech. So before we talk about some advantages that he can have in turtling in this particular, let's take a look at a slightly different approach to turtling here. Instead of gathering his units in the corner, here is a deployment area that I think is even better suited to his turtling, that allows him to converge his actual mechs here, here, and here, for example, and allow them enough freedom of movement to respond to whatever his opponent may do. So if his opponent decides to shift left or right, he can shift his mechs left or right as well. He's not locked into one part of the board. But he's also can start out of line of fire. I'm assuming these buildings actually block line of sight, whereas the ruins in the center there don't. So assuming whether it blocks line of sight or simply adds terrain modifiers, it's still a solid position by which to start your force because you're not in direct line of fire. You have control. You don't have to move out into exposure, and it gives you that option it leaves your options open. So If we start in this area, it looks like we're more vulnerable, but the reality is we're not. We're actually going to end up with better fields of fire, which you'll see in a moment, and that freedom of mobility that I talked about just a second ago. So let's take a close look at how could we move this. Let's just assume that we're going to move these in concert to support each other. Now I'm just going to choose one direction, but because of the gaps between these buildings, it's pretty easy to see how each of the mechs can simply slip out from behind cover into the next position. Okay, so we're going to assume that we're just going to skirt around to the left and step out for all three mechs into the building, occupying these ending positions, basically at the edge of that main thoroughfare. Now take a look at the fields of fire for the three mechs. I'll just throw them all, mech 1, mech 2, and mech 3. They have most of the board covered now with fire, and they can choose to concentrate their fire very freely. There's a very narrow point behind the central circular building tower in the middle that a enemy mech could hide behind and limit the incoming fire. So this is a really solid defensible position with a single movement bringing all the guns to bear into a large threat area. Now in this particular game system, you have long range shooting. You can shoot 42 inches across the table, and the length, the range, actually, the further away you are, the more minuses to hit. Now don't remember too well what range limits there may be on particular weapon systems as far as max range, but you'll notice in this deployment the ranges to across the street are much shorter than the original Turtle deployment, which with the units congregated in that far corner, where maybe some of their weapon systems are out of range until the opponent, taking their time to maneuver appropriately, can come out into the open at the last possible moment, minimizing the amount of threats they're being engaged by on their approach. Here, as soon as the opponent comes into the open, they're vulnerable to a lot of shooting. This really helps keep the opponent from maneuvering freely, and that again is a key piece. The biggest challenge in facing a turtling opponent is because by turtling, it does give you a lot of firepower available to against your opponent, and limits their freedom of movement quite substantially. They will have to take into account all the possible shots you can take, all the possible weapon systems you can put on them, and how best they can apply their systems to counteract yours. So assuming you've got a good mix of weapons to address the threats that are coming your way, this is a much better position to go at cover the entire field of fire, all the way down the street, all the way up to all the buildings. You're going to really be able to support yourselves very well, and also give yourself a chance to retreat quickly behind buildings if needed, and again maneuver out of the way, reposition if needed. All right, finally, let me mention one more thing. In the position we've got here, one of the things that's important is, once the opponent is in range, how do you handle the engagement? How do you engage the opponent with your weapons? Again, the advantage of this position is that you can bring all your weapon systems to bear onto one. Now, you have to be sure you have the discipline to, number one, identify the right target. What's the target priority? Pick the most dangerous threat. There's a video link to that in case you want to review that concept some more. Once you've done that, you need to make sure you're applying the right weapon systems to take that out. Now, hopefully you've got a good mix of weapons on your mech, so all of your mechs can apply the damage to that mech. And then concentrate your fire on the one threat until it's eliminated. Again, there's more videos to cover that topic. It's extremely important you focus your energy, no pun intended, energy weapons, on the single most important threat until it's eliminated or neutralized before you move on to the next one. So you may need to take all 3 mechs and fire it at just one mech instead of trying to hit multiple, a little bit damage in every other mech, just to see if you can, do the right critical hit to the systems. Focus your fire on the one. Conservation or application of mass. That's what you really want to do. You want to apply your combat capability in overwhelming firepower. So take a look. I'll throw some more links into other videos that kind of we've touched on some of the concepts here down in the description, so that you'll have a better feel for where you can go for more information. But for those of you who haven't already, take a look at my Academy playlist and see if there's any information in there that may help you with your games. So thanks for sticking around. I hope this video has been a really good, successful help for you. Please share, like, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.